Separating myth from reality in one of Canada's biggest industries. Hi, I'm Brian Lilly, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. You may have heard that the Carney government has a new auto strategy. You may have heard that they've done away with the EV mandate. There's talk of co-building Chinese, Canadian electric vehicles in this country, partnering with China. Does that make sense? And what about the fact that Stellantis, well, they got out of their deal to build battery plants? Does that mean, as some people are claiming, we're out $50 billion? There's a lot of myths out there. Joining me now to talk about this is Flavio Volpe. He is the president of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association, one of the leading auto industry groups in this country, and a man who knows of what he speaks. Flavio, where do we start? Let's start with the new auto strategy. One of the big headlines was that the Carney government walked away from the EV mandate. When I look at it, and we'll get into what's good about it in a minute, but that was one of the big headlines, walks away from the EV mandate. I looked at it and I said, that looks like what I reported several months ago. They're delaying it. They're stretching it out over many years, but they're still pushing towards that. Maybe they're calling it a goal now instead of a mandate. What's reality here in terms of, will people still be able to buy internal combustion engines if they want, EVs if they want, hybrids if they want?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to play Mythbusters because you've got part of the answer, and everybody's got part of the answer. The EV mandate was a very strict target for automakers: 20% in 2026, 60% in 2030, 100% in 2035. Where you had to, the cars that you sold in this country, not the ones you made, the ones you sold in this country, had to be either an EV or a plug-in hybrid EV. And that by the time you got to 2035, it was EV. And so automakers in this country said, okay, look, 2 million Canadians buy a car every year. This is a very important market for us. Why would we invest in manufacturing here? Why would we invest in sales and distribution network here if 95% of the vehicles we make today are going to get phased out or be illegal to sell here in 9 years? And they all pushed, and you and I talked about this when they launched it in 2022. We're not going to make those targets. To get to a target, automakers that fell short had to buy credits from those who just imported here, like Tesla from China
This
or
was very
VinFast.
lucrative for Tesla, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
I mean, yeah, we flowed with, they were building up credits that would have been in the billions. And so the prime minister got rid of that program. The Prime Minister Trudeau chose a program that chose a technology to get to an objective. They said, okay, if we're going to go to a carbon-free transportation sector, then we'll choose electric vehicles to get us there. The new system is a carbon target. How many CO2s per kilometer, grams of CO2 per kilometer out of the tailpipe? So what this allows automakers to do is to say, okay, the target is to have zero CO2s by 2040 and 75% elimination by 2035. That means an automaker can make a 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, 8-cylinder vehicle, and it can make EVs, and they can do hybrids, conventional or otherwise, or they could do like Hyundai and Kia and Toyota do, hydrogen fuel cell, as long as the fleet of vehicles that they sell meet a target. It doesn't make the vehicles that you sell here, it doesn't ban the vehicles that you sell here or make them illegal to sell in future years. You just have to manage your mix. And what the prime minister said is what the industry has been saying from the beginning. What's your target? If your target is carbon-free transportation, then don't dictate technologies. Some of us are really good in reducing carbon that leaves a tailpipe on internal combustion engine vehicles. Some of us are good in hybrids, like Toyota's 125,000 conventional hybrids that were built here last year, here in Ontario,
Yeah.
qualify for that program.
Hold on. So 125,000 hybrids were built by Toyota in Ontario alone.
Yes, last year. They'll
It,
do that
it,
every year.
and Toyota has been big. They've been saying for a while now, and folks will remember that they were the first electric vehicle that was really popular with the Prius, and yet they were like, no, we think hybrids the way to go going forward.
Yeah, what they said is, look, we appreciate it because we pioneered that you can clean the tailpipe emissions by electrifying a vehicle, but that consumers, uh, like in anything else, like to step into the full end of the range. Conventional hybrids, plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, and of course they had a hydrogen vehicle program as well. What Toyota was saying, and a lot of the other automakers were saying, is the actual number is going to be about 35% by 2035. We know that because the program that you set up on the EV mandates only measures the amount of sales. And if the automakers don't achieve those sales targets, regardless of why consumers bought or didn't buy their products, be the automakers that were penalized. And that's okay in a place like BC or in a place like Quebec or in a place like Montana or Oregon, where they don't make cars. But in Ontario, where we make cars, why would we penalize the automakers that employ people that get us there? And um, the automakers were also telling us this year there are 115 EV or plug-in hybrid EV options available to Canadian consumers. They're not buying them. There's lots of reasons why they're not buying them, not because they're inferior technology. I think they're superior technology. But Canadians have to pay for them, they have to maintain them, they have to charge them, they got to service them. And maybe it's not their use case.
Yeah,
Lots and lots of
yeah.
people
I
can
I
be.
live in a condo building in downtown Toronto.
Yeah.
I would not have a charging option at my home. I'd have to be going out and sitting in a parking lot doing public charging. Some folks I know do that. Others would balk at the idea. So as you say, there's lots of reasons for not doing that. Look, the Trudeau government's uh, policy, which Carney has changed and gone in a different direction, that was brought about when Gavin Newsom in California, Joe Biden at the White House in the United States, they were headed in that same direction, weren't they? Or were we going even faster than them?
No, they really jumped out there and made the business case for the manufacturers here who sell 85 to 90% of the vehicles we make there, really made the business case. They said, we'll subsidize production, we will subsidize every purchase by $7,500, and we're going to set a really aggressive target that was essentially the one that the Trudeau government came onto. And so by the time the Trudeau government came around to the EV mandate, it was essentially harmonized with where the US was going. And probably part of the reason why they didn't listen to the industry when they said it's not going to work and it's not going to happen. But what they did do, and I give them full credit because we were in the middle of that, was okay, well, they committed the same industrial supports and similar purchase incentives on the Canadian side. And so we were all going there together in North America and as part of the global trend in that direction. The
Yeah,
White House is the White
as
House
much
is
as I
back
don't
up.
like
Yeah,
the plan,
yeah,
it was in sync with the White House, with what the Americans are doing. Stephen Harper did that with Obama years ago, around 2008. No,
that's
no,
right.
it would have been 2009, 2010. Similar thing on emissions, not EVs. We weren't headed there yet. You've got to have a similar policy in this integrated market. But now that that's not happening in the US, maybe in California, but not statewide or US wide, it just didn't make sense anymore to continue this policy, did it?
No, and I think the new policy strikes a bit of a balance. It says that we're still going to try to be leaders in the space because we have critical minerals that we can deploy in the industry in quantities that exist only in China at that level, and so we can be a player. So we should push the market a little bit. Also use that to attract investors like Hyundai. So to say to Hyundai Kia, we're 250,000 sales every year in this country of those two joint brands. It's the same company. That's about 12% of the market. The Carney government is saying to them and to others like that, look, we can help articulate a an electrifying or a low carbon market for you, but we're not telling everybody they got to be EVs. You want to sell hydrogen fuel cell vehicles here? No problem. You choose the technology to get there. It is a little bit more aggressive than the Americans right now, but I think a bunch of us in the industry are saying, okay, it's not it's not terribly out of whack. the rest of the world has continued down that path. President Trump is currently uh, 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 holding back through the EPA, but about 40% of the US is aligned under the California standard, which is a bit higher. They're fighting each other. The next president of the United States, whoever it um, is going to come in at a time when the Americans will have hopefully found their feet on this, i.e., they're pushing really hard on the critical mineral side. They're pushing really hard for local investments. You know, his whole premise behind his trade war is we're either going to repatriate manufacturing here or we're going to force closures in other places to change our relative position. The bet is they're going to rejoin that trend. They'll set whatever level they're at, but they'll rejoin that trend. So,
So let's talk about the Stellantis and their decision to sell off their stake in the EV battery plant in Windsor. Um, I've seen some people claim online, well, we gave them $50 billion and now that money's all gone. First off, Stellantis was never promised 50 billion. Um, there was talk of between 12 and 15 billion potentially going to them in tax credits. And I'll get you to explain that if you wish to, but uh, they they only get money if they produce. So what's the reality here? By the way, that also was the decision to offer these supports to attract those investments, those subsidy supports, whatever you want to call them, those tax breaks. That was a result of trying to align with the Biden administration or compete with them, not align. That was to compete with them because the Biden administration was offering all kinds of incentives to get those plants down there. I remember my first column on the Stellantis announcement. If you hate this, blame Joe Biden. I put it right in there because it was the only way Canada could compete. What's going on with Stellantis now? Is that a dead plant or are they just exiting their investment stake?
no, first of all, the plant is up and running. Second of all, anybody telling you the $50 billion number either wants to tell you something that's not true or doesn't understand it. $50 billion was the gross number of total investments that Canada and Ontario and Quebec got committed from 6 different companies to either make electric vehicles or batteries. Within that, there was a joint venture between Stellantis and LG in Windsor to make batteries for vehicles that Stellantis makes in Windsor and vehicles that Stellantis was going to make in Brampton. It was a 5149 LG Stellantis plant. And the commitment of public dollars was an initial $1 billion between the two levels of government on a $5 billion plant. Okay, so that money's flowed. And then a commitment to match the Biden era production subsidies, i.e., you make batteries here, you show us how many you make, we're gonna give you $44 a watt. And so we match that with the caveat that if the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act commitments from the US were to disappear, then so would our obligation. So what's flowed into that plant is that initial capital support, that $1 billion on $5 billion, and that plant is up and running. What Stellantis has announced last week is, look, due to a lot of things, including the retrenching on EVs in the market and the trade war they're in, they booked a $26 billion charge. I mean, this is an incredible number that the company had to swallow. You know, Ford announced a couple of weeks ago $19 billion, and I thought everybody was going to lose their mind then. This was even more. This is how tough the auto business is right now. But what they did on this plant was they sold their stake to LG. So now LG owns it 100%.
For how much?
Oh, $100 or so. That doesn't
$100? That's it?
I can't remember what they booked. It was like nothing. But the point is, what we invested in, what the Ontario government and the federal government invested in, was this plant, co-owned by this joint venture, to produce batteries, to employ thousands of Canadians, and to provide those batteries for vehicle production in all of the Stellantis plants. It's still the exclusive supplier of those batteries. It's still up and it's run by LG. All that's happened is a restructuring to help Stellantis that's in real trouble.
So those production credits that they were getting, though, were ru- they depended on how many people they were employing and how many batteries they were producing,
No, the production credits were just on the batteries.
just on the batteries.
Yeah.
Are they employing enough people? Are they producing enough batteries? Or is this a white elephant?
Well, the other white elephants that we know, like Olympic Stadium in Montreal, we pay for it and then people don't come or it doesn't work. On this here, you only pay if they make the batteries. And if they make the batteries, so for example, that number that you talked about, 12 to $15 billion, that was the assumed maximum production of batteries in that plant per year for 10 years. So if you don't make half of that, so that's probably you know, a billion and a half a year. That's if you did $10 billion worth of activity. That's if you generated $1.3 billion worth of HST and all the corporate taxes and all the personal income taxes generated. If you didn't make those batteries, we don't owe you anything. And that company has pivoted right now while there's a lull in demand in EV to make utility charging units. I expect that plant to be the premier battery production plant in this country for the next 20 years. It's run by the biggest non Chinese battery maker in the world, LG.
Out of
And
Korea.
yeah, and South Korea is a great point. A market-driven economy. If you like LG, you can buy a share in it. If you like Shanghai Auto or Cherry Auto, you can't buy a share in it. I much prefer that our production subsidies go to companies that compete in a free market against and with Canadian companies.
And my argument for in support of this is that if they don't make the batteries, then they
Don't
don't
spend the
get
money. Yeah.
the credit. But also, well, 75% of something is better than 100% of nothing. Because as you mentioned, all the corporate taxes, the HST, the income taxes, that far outweighs anything. If they're at that production level, that far outweighs anything that they're getting in terms of a tax credit.
Yeah, look, I gave I'm giving numbers here. I want to give people context. That plant is set up to make 400,000 batteries for vehicles a year. That's a $25,000 battery. That's $10 billion worth of production. That production goes into the vehicles made in that town, and hopefully we reopen this Brampton plant after we get through this USMCA scenario. The transfer of those batteries from LG, the sale of them from LG to Stellantis includes the charge of HST. So if the government of Canada and the Ontario government in a shared environment pay $1 billion a year against that production level. Well, what they're doing is they're saying that for those 10 years, we will forgive HST. We'll forgive some of the corporate tax that you have there. There is no scenario in which the government, we, the taxpayers, pay for batteries that didn't get produced. And it was and it's also the clause in those deals are, hey, by the way, that's to match the US. And if the US isn't offering that as a tax credit, then sorry, you can't come to us for money.
You mentioned South Korean economy. The South Koreans are currently trying to sell us submarines for our Royal Canadian Navy. Part of the requirement, whether it's subs from South Korea or subs from Germany, is that, well, you want to sell us subs, you need to give us an auto plant. Uh, my view is I just prefer Hyundai over BMW. We're going to sell more of them here. We can build more of them. It's it. All you German car fans, calm down. I think we just sell more of them or more than VW. Is it realistic to think that we'll get an auto plant in Canada from Hyundai or Kia or one of the German firms in exchange for this subcontract?
It's a new way of negotiating. I don't know if it's realistic. I do know that I've had very senior conversations with people in both of those groups, and senior conversations with automakers that could potentially take up the call there. It's not like when you're dealing with China and everything's centrally planned, and you say, "Look, if you want this deal, give us some of that." There's nobody in the Korean government or the German government that is going to say to VW or to Hyundai. But they do work together on national interest. And typically, when you spend money in a defense procurement, it has to meet the defense specs. It absolutely has to be driven by the Department of National Defense. But in return, you get some industrial regional benefits. Hey, by the way, if you're going to make battleships, we've got shipyards, we've got steel mills. Here, what we're saying is, yeah, I get all that, but for example, on the Hyundai Kia side, Canadians buy 250,000 of those vehicles per year. That's enough vehicles to populate the entire production of an automotive plant. Now they're not all on the same platform, but about half of them are. And so, what we've been saying to Hyundai is, okay, look, you've got this national automotive strategy that's got supports for capital supports for companies that are going to build cleaner vehicles. We've moved away from an EV mandate to a carbon target. Canadians love your vehicles. You're not starting from scratch here. If you built that shared platform, half of your production would already be sold in Canada. And if you want to help your partners in other streams, like Hanwha is the company that would build subs. Well, Hanwha is a supplier to Hyundai, and Hyundai is a supplier to Hanwha in businesses all around the world. You're going to buy steel from Algoma. You know, the Koreans signed an MOU with Algoma in that space. These are the same conversations we're having with ThyssenKrupp Marine in Germany. But to your point, there isn't a German company that sells 250,000 vehicles to Canadians already. And to Volkswagen's credit, they they invested $7 billion into a battery plant here. So it's not like, hey, by the way, hey, Volkswagen, you owe us one. Well, at this point, it's pretty even.
Uh, we'll close with this on in terms of an overall auto strategy going forward. Is there a world where we get back to the point where we were producing cars like we used to? We used to produce 3 million cars a year. Now it's 1.3 million, and even that is under threat. So, setting aside the rhetoric out of the White House, saying we don't want cars out of Canada, is there a world where we start climbing up again instead of managing the decline?
We have about a half a million cars in idle capacity um, uh, today. Ford in Oakville, outside my window here, is getting ready to make F Series trucks for a year from now. We know that General Motors could sell more trucks in Oshawa than what they're selling now because of a tariff. We know that Brampton, if we regain access to the U.S., the Chrysler Halcyon, mark my words here, needs a place to be manufactured. I think the first step to getting back up to what I think is a natural level, Brian, which is about 2.25 million, maybe 2.5 is a stretch. We'll never get back to 3 million. That was just a really nice peak in 1998. But we're about a million behind where we should be. About half of that is waiting for us to get an exemption to these national security tariffs. Now that sounds like, oh yeah, well, hey, good luck for that. But we managed to advocate quietly but effectively for an auto parts exemption to those national security rules. We should be confident enough to try to figure out what the Americans need there. More American content, tighter rules of origin, push out Chinese components, whatever it is, we can get there. If we manage to figure out how to get another plant in here because of a submarine purchase, that's another 250,000 a year. And frankly, you and I have talked about this many times, but we're doing a deep dive and making a very strong case for domestic capacity. We haven't had a Canadian automaker for 100 years. We've made 120 million cars for other companies. We're about to spend $80 billion over the next 5 years of new money in the defense space. Those are new volumes. What can we make to support that effort for Canada and other NATO countries that doesn't compete with the RAV4s we make in Woodstock and the Silverados we make in Oshawa to do what Mexico is doing? Mexico says next time we have a shock from a Donald Trump, we're going to have a company called Olinea, which is a Mexican car company that is going to make city vehicles for Mexican buyers. I think for this new auto strategy to do something incremental and not just play good defense, but to do something that lasts so that our two kids can interview each other 20 years from now and say, "What did you do?" Well, we stood up a Canadian car company when we were under threat.
Could be interesting. Hopefully, it's not a Chinese Canadian co-venture, because as you recall from being at Queens Park back when the whole "Let's build solar panels with the Chinese" happened, they came in, they took the technology, they shut everything down here, moved everything back to China. They've got the technology now, but I just I don't see that idea of a co-venture being a good idea.
Let me walk you through that because you and I have this spiritual same ground on this one. And I did go from Queens Park into solar, so I still have the scars. Um, you're unlikely to see an automaker, sorry, a part supplier, be a joint venture partner with a Chinese automaker to make cars in this province. Because the first thing that the part suppliers, other customers, General Motors, Ford, Volkswagen will say, well, you're either supplying me or you're competing with me. You know, Magna flirted 15 years ago with making their own car under their own brand, and were quickly told by their OEM
Everyone.
customers, "Hey, you're the best supplier we have, but you might also be our best competitor, so not going to happen." Are we going to see automakers make deals with the Chinese? Well, we already know that Ford is talking to BYD and Chery, or at least according to reports, and that all of the other automakers are partners with the Chinese in China. But to set up a plant here to make 250,000 vehicles a year that currently aren't allowed in the US is not a business model anybody will take on. And if somebody did take that on, you'd have to wonder about their intentions. You'd have to say, that's not profitable. What's the actual objective? Uh, we think that what will likely happen is the Chinese, Donald Trump is going to Beijing in April. I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if he came back with a BYD deal. And that if the Chinese are going to make cars in North America, they're going to more likely do it in the US and make major powertrain investments in Canada. Uh,
So we'll
not
get parts, they'll get the assembly.
Well, it might be that if we get batteries, which are $25,000 components, and if those batteries can source the chemistry from here so that we're not just making battery trays and power electronics, that the guts of the stuff comes from the ground in Ontario and Quebec, then that's worth something. If they're making motors, if they're making e-gears, and big companies like Linamar and Martin Rea and Magna are doing them with Canadian materials and Canadian workers, that's more likely.
Okay, it's going to be an interesting time. Flavio, thanks for helping separate myth from reality where we could and giving us a sense of where things may go in the future. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for caring enough to ask. I appreciate it.
All right, let us know what you think. Drop a comment down below, share this on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.